Welcome to my YouTube channel Sushantreddy. Every week, I present my life lessons as an entrepreneur in sales, human psychology, and wealth creation. In the second episode of the Risk and Probability series, I discuss the concept of survivorship bias. We start with the definition and then go into the details and examples of this topic. I refer to the ideas of Nassim Taleb and Morgan Housel from their respective books while discussing this subject. In the last episode, I defined risk as the possibility of total loss. I introduced probability distribution and the concept of tails that signify extreme events. I demonstrated the income probability distribution of a government bureaucrat, a consultant, a mid-level manager, and an entrepreneur, and showed how tails get fatter as we move from a bureaucrat to an entrepreneur. We then talked about the risk-reward curve and showed that in the realm of probability, this curve is actually a collection of different probability distribution curves where a line runs through the highest point of distribution. Now, as we increase the risk profile, we end up having fatter and longer tails. We then introduced the concept of systematic mispricing of risk. How entrepreneurs in particular tend to romanticize the probability curve. This leads to an underestimation of risk and overestimation of rewards. A big cause of this systematic mispricing is what we call the survivorship bias. That is the subject of discussion of this episode. When I lived in New York City, I noticed that most people in Manhattan had fit bodies with low fat and high muscle content. I also saw impeccably dressed men and women on the streets. I was a thin guy with negligible fashion sense, and I couldn't help but feel a bit low on self-esteem and confidence during this time. It took me a while to realize that I had fallen victim to the survivorship bias. So what is this survivorship bias? Survivorship bias is a misjudgment that happens when you encounter survivors more often than you encounter losers. When you mistake a small sample of observations to be the universe of possible observations, you fall victim to survivorship bias. Let's say we have a white box. This box represents a universe of all possibilities that can happen over a given time span. Event to the right denotes a success and event to the left denotes a failure. Now suppose you are blindsided to all the events on the left side. Let's say someone set up a Chinese wall in between and you can't see the events to the left of this wall. In effect, this Chinese wall is shielding you from observing failures. You start believing that the events you see represent the entire universe. Since your observed set of possibilities is only a small subset of the universe of possibilities, any decision you take about the future based on your observed universe has an intrinsic bias towards success. If we go back to our probability distribution curve and consider only the points on the right tail and plot a distribution, you again magically get a distribution that looks like a bell curve. In reality, this curve is actually a skewed distribution. It is skewed because it has ignored a vast number of possibilities at the center and the left of the original distribution. As a result, you get a new distribution where the worst case scenario is also moderately positive and the average case is actually a best case scenario of the original distribution. This skewness in probability distribution leads to a classic misjudgment that has two fatal flaws. One, it overestimates the best case, and two, it underestimates the worst case. Let's understand this better with an example. Let's assume Adam is a newly married banker who makes 400,000 US annually. Adam and his wife Jenna stay in a condo in Jersey City. Now, Adam stays in a quiet neighborhood and the couple has a relatively pleasant lifestyle. Adam is in the top 1% of income distribution curve in the United States, where the median income is $70,000. Adam takes an offer as a CFO of a tech startup in Silicon Valley at the same salary, and the couple moves to California. Adam now finds himself in the top 5% of the people in Silicon Valley whose median income is $140,000 US. Now, the couple has a son, and Jenna wants them to move to Atherton town in San Mateo because they have better schools in that area. Median income in Atherton is 525,000 US dollars. Suddenly, Adam finds himself in the bottom 50% of the Atherton families. Adam and Jenna make friends with other parents at their son's school and find themselves miserable when trying to match the living standards of the other parents. So, a happy couple in Jersey City became slightly insecure after going to Silicon Valley and totally insecure after ending up at Atherton. How can the same person with the same earning capacity end up from confidence to misery? The answer lies in survivorship bias. Perception of the self changes when one skews a distribution that sees success more often than failure. This is what happened to me when I was in Manhattan. Since the stakes for an entrepreneur are much higher, survivorship bias can cause serious misjudgment and in some cases can lead to existential crisis for an entrepreneur. Let's see how. If you plot the capability of a person versus the survivorship bias, you will see an interesting curve. More capable a person, more likely that person will face survivorship bias. This is simply because a capable person ends up putting himself or herself in a place that attracts other capable people. For example, a guy who topped math at school consistently is likely to end up in the math or economics department at Harvard or Yale or Stanford, where he will encounter people better than him at math. If you plot growth versus time, a person having a strong survivorship bias expects consistent growth over time. Why? Because he has seen other people who got consistent growth over time. What he hasn't seen and therefore doesn't know is that there are a lot more people out there who have seen little growth over time. So when reality happens in the form of much slower growth, he is angry and frustrated at the gap between his expectations and reality. Let's say there are two entrepreneurs, A and B. B is much more capable than A at a particular task. B is more likely to have a higher survivorship bias because B would be in the network of people who are more capable than he is. Since B has higher survivorship bias, B will also have a steeper expectation of growth over time compared to A. And since life is not always fair, B and A could end up having a similar growth curve in reality. As a result, B ends up with a much bigger gap than A. B is more restless, desperate, and angry at himself for not being more successful than A. Chances are B calls it quits or takes unnecessarily large risks to compensate for the lost growth. This could lead to existential challenges for B. An awareness of survivorship bias can trigger positive emotions when B encounters a large gap between expectation and reality. Such positive emotions could lead to persistence, inspiration, humility, and gratitude. A lack of awareness of survivorship bias makes one a victim of negative emotions such as envy, jealousy, frustration, and anger. These emotions can drive a person to make wrong and mindless decisions. That is why it is important to understand this concept and constantly filter out such a bias from decision making. In the world we live in, some form of survivorship bias is everywhere, making many a victim of poor decision making. From the aura of Ivy League schools to the freshly minted unicorns to the craze of Bitcoin investments to how we want to look, who we want to marry, we have survivorship bias everywhere. In the next episode, I discuss why survivorship bias exists in the first place and practical ways to filter out this bias from our decision making process. In my view, filtering the bias always improves decision making in a probabilistic world. To summarize, survivorship bias is when we focus on success and ignore failure. Bias changes our perception of self. Greater the bias, greater is the gap between expectation and reality. People who are more capable are more likely to become victims of survivorship bias. Awareness of bias leads to positive emotions. Lack of awareness creates negative emotions like fear, envy, jealousy, hatred, and anger. Thanks for watching. For weekly videos, you can subscribe to my channel or to my newsletter on sushantreddy.com. Until next time, stay safe and goodbye.